Hi, class. This is your Professor Joseph. Welcome to Chapter 8. Today I'm going to be discussing Plato, a little mini lecture, and how all these pieces come together with your reading so far and how they land on Plato, and also what his reading does in the grand scheme of philosophy as a whole. So here we go. There's Plato. There's dispute on when he was born and when he was died. Isn't that crazy? But this comes from a very famous painting. There's a bunch of pictures we could look at, with Plato. There's a bunch of sculptures that we could look at, but here's a painting. This was done. So basically, that picture of Plato was in the School of Athens, which is super famous. You see it everywhere, and you might be wondering, like, what's the significance? Well, that's Plato, and that's Aristotle. Plato formed the very first university. That was, I mean, when you ask where do colleges come from, Plato, and Aristotle was his huge, big time student. And they agreed on a lot of things, and they also disagreed. So that's why they're the focal point of this painting. But anyways, this was done by Raphael, an artist, 1509 to 1511, and of course Plato's way before that. We're talking before Christ. So 428 to 427, and then 347 BC. So a lot longer of a time period from Plato to Raphael. But Raphael, when he does this painting, he has a lot of things in mind. So there's Raphael. He's mentioned in the reading. So if you wanted to, you could click this video and start at 1 minute 37 seconds. And these two people break down what's going on inside this painting. In fact, we'll go there. It's really fascinating to know Raphael wasn't just painting Plato and Aristotle. He was painting many philosophers. Let me see if I can get to this. It's on the, okay. So there is a total of possibly 21 people he could have been painting, and they're numbered. Now, Plato and Aristotle are super obvious, and there's a few others that are definitely completely like non-disputed. But then there's others where scholars are like, okay, was Raphael trying to paint this guy or this guy? We don't know. So, anyways, if you wanted to look into this, really fascinating. And then Raphael paints himself in there. You can look at that. But anyways, all that's discussed in the video. But it's very fascinating how Raphael uses colors even to distinguish between these two philosophers. It's really cool stuff. Anyways, so that's in there. Plato's Cave. Oh man, that is. Has anybody seen the movie The Matrix? The Matrix gets its huge premise on deception versus what's real versus what's not real. That goes right back to Plato's Cave. So you can see this video, and it's also in your reading, and you can see the parallels between a lot of movies that are out now that are all sci-fi, and things like the what's it called? There's something, what is it, Elon Musk talks about living in the Matrix, or the like things that we perceive them aren't real. Anyways, there's a huge name for it, theory, but a lot of it has to go. A lot of it owes its origination into things like Descartes' evil genius, which we're not going to discuss in this semester, and he even gets a lot of his ideas from Plato's Cave. So you can look at that allegory of the cave. This is a cool like clay video that's like a few minutes long, and then here's another video, allegory of the cave. And I choose this video. It's I'll scour through videos on the internet, but I really like these two. And then the Ring of Gyges. Now this is important because Plato, he contributes to a lot of branches of philosophy, and you're only seeing a few snapshots of what he's done in this reading. But the Ring of Gyges is a discussion between Gyges and Socrates, and the question of why be moral arises. So now we're into ethics, good, bad, right, and wrong. And why do the right thing? Like, who cares? What does it matter, right? So the question, why be moral, is, does it benefit us to do the right thing? And it's a very fascinating dialogue, and you'll see what Socrates has to say with Glaucon, because Glaucon, well, I'm not going to tell you the answer. This is going to tell you. If you're reading, Watch this video. And this, yeah. So, anyways, it's just once you figure out what Socrates says and the comparison that he makes between two different kinds of people. Me personally, I think it's mind blowing, mind blowing. Because you could think about like you could be a liar, a manipulator, con man, bullshitter your whole life. If you could get away with it, I mean, if you could get away with every single thing that's wrong and nobody would know about it, only you would know about it, and it benefited you, as far as like getting along with people in society, getting money, whatever, would you do it? Well, Socrates counters Glaucon's thought experiment, and he tells you why it's not profitable to be a bullshitter or a liar or, manipulate other people. And it's profound. So there you go. And you can get more in depth on this painting. And now let's jump into your reading. So here we are with Plato, knowing the real and the good. So the real, that has everything to do with Plato's cave, or allegory of the cave, as it's most famously named. And then the good, you can think of good, bad, right, and wrong here, and the story of the ring of Gyges. But again, Plato has many dialogues and books. This reading taps into just a few. And here we go. So the context of this is, think of, and I always do the Star Wars analogy, like Yoda, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Luke Skywalker. Yoda's like Socrates, Obi-Wan Kenobi is like Plato, and Luke Skywalker is like Aristotle. These are badass mofos in Star Wars. They are awesome, and they use the Force, and they're very powerful, and they had a lot of training. Similarly, just like those three with Star Wars, and if you haven't seen Star Wars, I mean, are you kidding me? You got to go watch it. You got to go watch all 9 parts. They're awesome. But similarly, in Greece, ancient Greece, you have 3 badass mofos named Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates trained Plato. Plato trained Aristotle. Aristotle is, I don't know if anybody knows this, and we'll see this later, he trained Alexander the Great, who basically was the supreme ruler of the Greek Empire before the Roman Empire took over. And Alexander the Great was so smart. Why? Because he was trained by Aristotle, who was trained by Plato, who was trained by Socrates. Can you imagine having a tutor like that in your life? Well, we'll see why these people matter. But to have 3 of these philosophers paired up like this, with each other in history is awesome. So long story short, if you got anything from this entire class of ancient to medieval philosophy, I would emphasize these 3 over everybody else: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Even though the other philosophers that we're going to talk about they're awesome in their own right, these 3 have profound contributions. For example, like, where do we get the Socratic method? You learned about that last week. Plato has a massive contribution in politics. Like, where do we get governments from? What's an effective government versus a non-effective government of tyranny, where people take over and there's total chaos and all that kind of stuff? What does Plato have to say about that? Everything. He has this huge book called Plato's Republic. Anybody who's in politics or studies politics goes through that book first. So that's just one of many things that he's contributed to. But in this reading, and this is a famous quote by a guy named Alfred North Whitehead. Let me read it to you. So, the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. What's this mean? Well, Whitehead was a famous philosopher in the last, couple hundred years. But he's basically saying, look, if anything's important in all of Western philosophy, guess what? It comes from Plato. Or we'll have to footnote Plato and say, yeah, he kind of started this conversation. That's how awesome Plato was. And the reason this chapter is unique in this semester for you is because now we're getting to very specific contributions of philosophy, whereas when we started with Homer and Hesiod and Democritus, philosophers like that, they made a few good points and some of them were not so good, and they were very general about the cosmos and God and the gods. And you're like, okay, like what the heck is going on? Plato gets very, very specific and starts making very specific claims about reality. So, um, yeah, so in that sense, you walk away possibly with more questions than you had, but you start thinking more deeply about reality than you had before you got to Plato. So there you go. Yeah, so a little mention of Raphael, School of Athens. You can look about that. But I'm not going to be talking about everything in this reading, of course, but I'll just highlight a few things that I think are important. Okay, so before we get to, yeah, let's just start right here. Knowledge versus opinion. And just quickly, he gives you a little chart on knowledge versus opinion on page 151. Very fascinating. Like, people opine or give their opinions all day long. Talk show, radio hosts, podcasts, all day long, people are giving their opinions. But are they giving you knowledge? Some are, and some are mixed with opinion. How does Plato see the two? Very fascinating. Opinion, changeable. Knowledge endures or stays put. Opinion may be true or false. Knowledge, always true. Really cool stuff right here. So this gets into a broader category of philosophy called epistemology. So if we go back up a couple pages, uh, Melkert is basically drawing the distinction like, hey, Plato is asking you to think about, many different things in this chapter, but he contributes to epistemology, his theory of knowledge, metaphysics, his theory of reality. These are huge branches of philosophy. And later on with the Ring of Gyges, he'll contribute to ethics. But let's do this. Let's go into, okay, so basically, let's see if my little pen thingy works. Let's see if I get this. Yes. Okay. So philosophy, we saw this in week one. Basically, we're talking about the love of wisdom. Let me switch colors here. There we go, love of wisdom. And branches of philosophy. So we get logic, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, existentialism. You might throw politics up there, right? We could throw another branch up there. So Plato will land himself primarily into metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics for this reading. Next week, when we get into Aristotle, we'll see that he lands into logic and ethics, but way more specific about ethics than Plato, you might say. And of course, metaphysics and epistemology. So these are heavy-hitting philosophers. They contribute to all of these branches, but in this reading, specifically metaphysics and epistemology. Why do I do this? Throughout this semester, you're going to be learning about a lot of philosophers, and you're going to be learning about a lot of ideas flying at you. And some of it creates a lot of confusion. Some of you are like, oh my gosh, this is a lot of detail. What do I do? So what I do is give you a good overview, categories. Now, some of these categories are distinct, but it turns out that what you believe in metaphysics might relate to epistemology, which might relate to ethics, which might relate to aesthetics. So you might have interconnectedness going on between these categories, right? For some of you, when we read Plato and we talk about Plato's cave, you look through the video, you're primarily learning about metaphysics and epistemology. What can we know? What reality is? So depending on what you think you can know might have everything to do with what you think reality is, might have everything to do with what you think good, bad, and right or wrong is. So these are the general categories or the main branches of philosophy that a lot of these philosophers will tap into. So keep that in mind. This is the broad. In fact, I'll make this more specific for you. This is more broad thinking, more wide range thinking, all these different categories. And then the specific are the actual philosophers and what they've contributed to each you know, category, if not all. Okay, so keep that in mind. And so today, just to give you a rundown, so logic is, and this might be a review for some of you, logic, it deals with arguments, argument structures, soundness, reasons to believe, evidence, how to make a good argument. And as we saw with last week's reading, the sophists, they don't care about good arguments. They care about persuasion and manipulating you to believing the conclusion of an argument, whether it's good or not. They're not really into logic as much as they are manipulating logic to get you to believe whatever they want you to believe. Metaphysics, they ask questions, or metaphysicians ask questions about what is reality, what is something, um, what is God, does God exist? It has everything to do with substance and properties and relationships to in between these things. So it asks the big "what is it" question, or questions. So in metaphysics, you can get philosophy of religion and talks about gods, the problem of evil. You can talk about metaphysics of agency when you talk about free will. Are we free or not? Um, all kinds of things can come out of metaphysics. Epistemology deals with knowledge and um, true belief and skepticism, things like that. So you might say that starting with Plato, very briefly, when you look at the difference between opinion and knowledge, you might say, well, what is knowledge? Can we construct a definition of it? You might say, in short, knowledge is. Let me click over a different pen color here. You might say knowledge is justified, true belief. Justified, you have good reasons to believe, you have evidence. True, it literally is true. It matches onto reality. It's not something that you're hallucinating about. And believing it is you have a thought in your mind and you're ready to act in reality as if it's true. That's what a belief is. So you might say justified true belief. If you have justification, if you have truth, if you have belief, then you have an instance of knowledge, right? So why is that important? Because philosophers, when you are trying to get away from sophistry and manipulating people, you want to get away from skepticism. Skepticism would say something like, hey, you can't really know what's out there. Knowledge is really hard to get at, and the only thing you're going to have is skepticism. You don't really know anything. So if you can battle skepticism, it has to come in the form of knowledge, justified true belief. So that's why it's important, because the philosopher's death wish is skepticism. You don't want to be a skeptic. You want to have knowledge. You want to have true belief. That's what makes you flourish as a human agent in reality, right? I mean, at least that's why you're here taking this college class, learning about ancient philosophers, right? You want true belief. You don't want skepticism. What's that going to do for you? Well, in one sense, and we'll see this later, skepticism might help you so that you don't believe every single thing you hear. But in one sense, you want knowledge. You want to know at the end of the day, 2 plus 2 equals 4 and not 5, right? You know what I'm saying? So Plato takes on metaphysics, some of these claims in epistemology in his reading here. And when he talks about knowledge, he just gets straight to it and says, look, knowledge is different from opinion. And I'm giving you justified true belief because since Plato, this has been the main debate. Can we have knowledge? So in ethics, good, bad, right, and wrong. In aesthetics, it deals with beauty. What is beautiful? And it's not just people going to a school of aesthetics, learning how to do hair and skin toning and nail painting. Oh, no, 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 no. This goes way back to ancient Greece. What is beautiful? And think about it this way. We seek beauty all the time in our life. When we listen to music, whether you go to a rave or watch a movie or listen to a podcast, you want beauty. You want something good. It's pleasing to you, right? This is where we get this aesthetically pleasing thing. Some people like watching football games. Some people like listening to music. Some people like listening to Buddhist meditation bowls, like cool stuff like that. That is seeking Beauty. What about a vacation? You want to go to Hawaii or Bora Bora and like, chill out in some super like tropical, beautiful destination? Guess what? It has everything to do with aesthetics. What is beautiful? What is sublime? I'm not talking about the band Sublime. I'm talking about what is sublime. Well, it's something beautiful, but on a huge, grand scale, like the Grand Canyon or like a massive waterfall. When you look at it, you're like, okay, look, there's beautiful and there's ugly and then there's sublime. This thing is overwhelming. I can't explain it. Beautiful. That's sublime. What about the northern lights, the aurora borealis? Anybody heard of those? I've seen them in Alaska. You look up in the sky, and you're just like, oh my gosh! You just see all kinds of rainbow lights at night. You're like, how in the world does this happen? Magnetic poles, bending light, and all kinds of weird stuff like that. But you might say, that's sublime. That's very beautiful. That has everything to do with aesthetics. So, anyways, I'm talking your ear off, but it's really good to know about these main branches of philosophy in the background so that when you come to a new philosopher, you say to yourself, how did they contribute to these new branches Joseph's telling me about? Oh, sorry, these old branches of philosophy. What about existentialism? What does it mean to be human? Um, what is human nature? Let me unpack this for a second. So we know Aristotle talks about the function, and you'll see this later on, and Socrates alluded to it, and Plato does too, the function of something. So what is a knife or a good knife? What's an excellent knife? Something that cuts well. What's an excellent eraser? Something that erases well. What's an excellent cup of coffee? You know what I'm saying? Like something that tastes good. On that line, what's an excellent human being? Now, just in the background, imagine if you could hear a record scratch. Humans are crazy, complex, wild, and sometimes insane animals. Rational animals, but what does it mean to be a good human? Nobody knows. We all have these theories. Aristotle, we'll see how he contributes to this later, and it's very profound, but that's existentialism. What does it mean to be human? How do I become a better human? Um, so there you go. I think this has helped some of you because in philosophy things seem to be a little bit overwhelming. But if I can give you main branches of philosophy like logic, epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, existentialism, we could even throw, what is it, politics up there. Um, so there you go. So Plato, back to Plato in our reading. He contributes to these main branches. And we can see this with your essential points. Where do you find that at? I'm glad you asked. You go back out to your modules. For example, whatever week you're in, whatever reading you're in, essentials for the reading. Here we are at Plato, essentials, click it, boom. You can download it, and then voila, you're staring right at it. So what are the bullet points? What are the main things that I want you to know with this reading? Here they are. And we've already went over knowledge and opinion, right? Epistemology, metaphysics. Okay, what's semantics? Well, that has everything to do with word meaning. So you can browse through this myth of the cave or allegory of the cave, or Plato's cave. You can hear it a bunch of different ways. The soul, he talks about that and parts of the soul. I won't get into that with you now, but pretty fascinating actually. And then morality. And for the story of Gyges in this reading, really cool. Like I said, the dialogue between Glaucon and Socrates, and why be moral, and he answers that question. And then the state. This basically talks about politics. Has anybody ever heard of the philosopher kings? If you've never heard of that, it goes back to Plato. He thinks this is going to be cool for some of you. He thinks the most perfect form of government, wherever it is, and back in his day it was Athens, right? Athens, Greece. He asks the question, who should be in charge of the government? Philosopher kings. Well, who are they? People who are philosophers, who are wise, who study about very important things like logic, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, existentialism. Can you imagine if you studied this for years and you knew a lot about these categories, how smart you'd be, how wise you'd be? Well, that's what Plato thought. And he thought people like that were called philosopher kings, and they should be rulers of the government. Very fascinating. So that's it for your essentials. Again, you could spend a whole semester. In fact, I have on Plato. You could spend a whole semester on Socrates, like a whole class. Just to let you know, like in my PhD program, I literally have. We took a class of Socrates, and in doing that, you kind of get Socrates and Plato in the same class because Socrates never wrote anything, Plato did for him. So when you're studying Socrates, you're really studying Plato as well. And then I took a whole class on Aristotle, like a couple classes actually. I took one class on Aristotle's justice. Can you imagine? A whole class on justice from Aristotle's perspective, a whole semester long just on that. Wow. So long story short, these are powerful philosophers. They have a lot to say, and we can spend a lot of time discussing every one of them individually, but especially Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato. So, yeah, what's the difference between knowledge and opinion? What's the difference between knowing and believing? You got to read this stuff. It's really cool. Watch the videos. You'll love them. You can dabble in this square right here. Pretty complicated, but that's how deep Plato was. There's a statue or a sculpture of what he looked like. If you could actually look at Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates, they're all bearded folk. So you're like, look, dude, you all got beards. It's as if you were to drive up to Oregon and see a bunch of bearded folk. You'd be looking at Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, like kind of how they looked. But yes, let me see if something stands out. Epistemological argument, the theory of forms. This is Plato's big deal. Remember when Socrates was walking around questioning everybody on what they knew and how they knew it and whether they knew anything at all? He was really getting at something deeper, something abstract, something perfect, something eternal. And Plato really taps into this. This is where Plato separates himself from Socrates and creates his own theory of forms. And he would say something like, hey, when we're talking about squareness or triangularity or circleness, like, when you look at a circle and you think about circularity or triangle and you look at triangularity, like three sides, angles adding up to, a certain amount, a square having four sides, right angles on each corner, things like that. Plato would say, you can see these represented in reality, but all you're looking at is a copy. A real perfect square is something that is eternal. It doesn't exist just on the earth where we could see it. Like I can draw a square on a board and show it to you. You could pick up something that's circular off the ground and show it to somebody, or something that's triangular. But ultimately, the definitions or the essences of these things are in what's called Plato's heaven. They're abstract. They exist out there where they're eternal. So theory of forms has everything to do with perfect essences that exist out there where you can't put your finger on it, but they have everything to do with copies in reality that we see. For example, humans. Like we can look at millions of humans all day long, right, throughout our life, and say, oh, there's a human, and point to them all day long. But Plato could raise a question, well, what is humanness? What is common to all humans? Whatever that is a form of humanness, and it's abstract, it's eternal, it doesn't change. Very fascinating. So this is where Plato gets deep real fast. So those are just a few examples. You can list some of these arguments he generates, but mainly what I want you to know is his theory of forms. What is it? How does he contribute? Yeah, this, you can just look at this. It gets a little deep there, almost too deep, because this is an intro class, but you can look at this. I would say do the reading. If you're confused, look at some of the videos, and it'll make sense pretty quickly, But the bottom line for Aristotle is that his allegory of the cave is really about is really a deeper meaning about philosophy and the role that it plays in your life. So you'll see that here, an allegory of the cave, these two videos. What it's really about is philosophy is like the sunlight. It's pure, it gives you absolute knowledge, and the only way you're ever going to know anything in reality is if you become a philosopher, because ultimately philosophy will point you towards the truth. And if you don't study philosophy, you're just lost in a world of shadows stuck in a cave. So you might say that's a big time bottom line for Plato. So if you're a truth seeker, which all of us are, you're going to want to know something about philosophy. And so Plato, in making this distinction about truth and being lost in a cave of shadows, is this: truth is not relative. In other words, what's true for me is true for me, and it might be different for you. No. That's not the case with Plato. Truth is absolute. It applies to everybody, everywhere, at all times. Like 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's not relative, ladies and gentlemen. If somebody says, hey, 2 plus 2 equals 5, something's not going right. So Plato would say, exactly, we could start with 2 plus 2 equals 5. We could know that that's the case. We could prove this to you. We could have an instance of knowledge. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is not an opinion. It's an instance of knowledge, right? You can start there and get other instances of knowledge by building on from that one instance, right? So he's not going to say truth is relative. We don't make up truth. Truth is truth. So that's the difference between Plato and the world we live in now. The world we live in now, and we don't discuss this here, but it's in my modern philosophy class, we live in a post-relative world or postmodernist world where truth is relative. And I'm not saying that it is, but that's a prevailing worldview out there right now that we live in, this society where what's true for me is true for me. It might not be true for you. Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle would disagree with that 100%. So that's the difference between ancient philosophy and, you might say, certain aspects of modern philosophy. Where do you see yourself? Do you think that there's absolute truth out there? Or do you not? You think truth is relative? And if truth is relative, then you might ask, well, what's the point in being at school when you could just make up your own truth and it's relative to anybody else? So, like, who cares? Like, there is no sort of truth. And then guess where you're at? Right when you start crossing into that line, you're right back at skepticism. The very thing that Socrates and Plato were trying to avoid with the sophists. They wanted to avoid skepticism. They wanted to know certain things for absolute truth. Why? Because they argued that it would make you a better person. At that point, you would be more virtuous. You would apply it to yourself. You would have better character, and you would make better action. You would make better decisions in the world because you would have You would have action guiding traits like truth. So, if I were to demonstrate that with a diagram, you might say, "What's the purpose of this class?" Well, true belief. Does it get you? So we're talking about reality. What the hey is going on out there. That's why we're in this philosophy class. We want to learn all these things. We want true belief. We want to avoid skepticism, relativism. Relativism would be like the truth is relative from person to person. Skepticism would be like the truth doesn't really exist. You can't really know it. Therefore, you can't really have any sort of knowledge. Well, Plato would say, hey, we're going to avoid this. And he's going to say pure philosophy and his theory of forms is going to get you this. And as a result, you'll make better decisions in life, kind of thing. Okay, so trying to take the deep and the abstract and try to make it more applicable to your own life now. But I'd say that's about it. So you're just getting a dabble at Plato and how he rolls. And again, back to the coolest painting ever. And and why it's so famous. And who's at the forefront? Who's right smack dab in the middle of the painting? Plato and Aristotle. One critique to Raphael, and it's this: hey, bro, where is Socrates at? Where's my man Socrates? He's not in there. You know what I'm saying? You might think that that's Socrates, but I don't think it's Socrates. He's not in this painting. That's the only tidbit I'd say. You gotta put him in there. But anyways, that's it. If you have any questions, reach out to me. I try to make these little mini lectures entertaining so you don't fall asleep. Because philosophy is totally abstract, so I want to make it more applicable to your life. That's about it. Um, yes. All right. Enjoy and reach out to me if you have any questions.